Hey Jesse, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Cool, awesome. So on this week's edition of the Data Nerd Herd, we have Jesse Anderson, the author of Data Teams, a unified management model for successful data-focused teams. So welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Cool. So for people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. As you mentioned, I just wrote a book. It's called Data Teams. If you haven't read my work, I invite you to read my work. I've done quite a bit of work on not just the technical side. There's lots of people talking about the tech side, but I've really been trying to marry the tech and the organizational side. So the book I wrote previously to this was called Data Teams, that talked about how does a data engineering team, excuse me, the book I wrote was called Data Engineering Teams. And it was a book about how does the data engineering team interface with the rest of the business, data science teams, what have you. And one before that was about how people can switch peers to big data. So I've been a real proponent of data engineering, and it seems like my hunch is paying off because now we're really starting to see it in the news and see people talking about it, which is great. Before that, I was at Cloudera. I was early on at Cloudera, and before that, even well before that, heads down software engineer. So
Nice.
lots of experience there.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I first came across you when I read the data engineering team's book, actually, from must have been 2016 or something like that when you wrote that.
Boy, it's probably been 4 years.
Okay,
I,
that seems about right. Yeah, 'cause I think I was managing a data team at the time, and there really weren't any good resources out about that. I mean, there are books on management, but that's not the really. I don't put this in the same category as managing a data team. So, yeah, you're just one of the first books I came across on it, and I think it was one of the best resources I've still seen to this day on data engineering teams. So thanks.
well, thank you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, on that note too, I mean, you mentioned something else that's pretty interesting, and we'll talk about your book in a bit. But just the fact that you've been talking about data engineering for quite a while. I mean, what did you notice about data engineering that other people weren't noticing at the time?
I noticed that based on my time at Cloudera that we were thinking this was the problems with big data, the low, incredibly low success rate with big data was all technical. It was this Hadoop thing didn't work, this Hive thing didn't work. And the reality was that that was a problem, but it was not the problem. And so the problem was actually we were having the wrong teams. We were homing our or starting the wrong with the wrong teams, and therefore those wrong teams, those wrong skilled teams, were causing failures. And so as I talked to other people about that, I would say, hey, do you understand this? Do you know this? So people who were in the industry, who'd been in the industry for a while, it was plain as day to them. It was, oh yeah, they're doing it the wrong way. And but you'd look around, and as you just mentioned, there was no resource, there was no book that said, hey, you're doing this the wrong way. And so I set out to try to try to cut that, cauterize that wound of all these failures, because if we have all these failures, eventually the party stops. And I've talked about this in my writing as well. If we don't start moving that success rate up, this party stops because the business will say, "Oh, that big data thing, I'm going to go actually. I'll have better odds of success putting it all on black. Let's go to Las Vegas. We'll tell the company we'll double our money that way." And so you people like you and I, we lose our jobs out of this. So it was really this, and it was incredibly important to say, no, we actually need to move the industry forward. We need to start saying, here are the best practices. Otherwise, no one will ever be able to create this value. So it all started with, no, it isn't a technology issue. It is an organizational issue up front. And I've given these talks about that, even showing visualizations of early success or failure is completely determined based on management and organizational. It is not technical.
Yeah, it's interesting. Had a lot of the same observations too back in the day. It was mainly a kind of a tooling discussion, right? Like how big is your data? Like, are you running a massive Hadoop cluster? And very little attention being paid to the people element of it. And in your book, I mean, you kind of mention in your data teams book, I mean, I think you give a very good blueprint for how somebody should think about data teams. But for those who haven't read the book, I mean, why would a data team be important? Why is that more important than the technology considerations?
Well, it's the technology considerations are putting the cart before the horse. In other words, if you come in thinking, uh, we just need to do some Hadoop, we just need to do some Spark, and everything will come out in the wash, that's wrong. It You put the right people in place, those right people will then choose the right technologies, and then you'll be success. But that success is always predicated, always from that source of the right people. So as you were just mentioning, it becomes this initial discussion of which Spark or which version of Spark, which is it Hadoop or Spark? That's the wrong discussion. That's the wrong starting point. You start with the use cases. You start with the team. You hire the right team. That team will then understand the use cases, will choose the right things. Because guess what? Spark may or may not be the right thing for you. You may actually be better served by this. Or more commonly, you'll need Spark and this and that and that. And that's where your data teams come in.
And so the thing I found very interesting about your approach is that you mentioned there's actually three teams that a company needs to consider. Do you want to walk through those?
Sure. So those three teams are data science, data engineering, and operations. And I'll go through and define each one. But for those listening, they probably heard the data science. Everybody's heard the data science. And what initially happened was people would, or organizations more correctly, would get that message of, oh, I just need to hire a data scientist. That's it. Data scientist will create all of this analytics, all these models, and that's not really the case. Because the data scientist, that data science team is made up of data scientists. The data scientists are, my definition of them is a person who has a mathematical or statistical background, who has then learned some coding. And that some coding is key, because we'll talk about that in a second. Then definition of data engineering, mostly made up of data engineers. And my definition of data engineers are software engineers who have taken those software engineering skills and specialized them in big data. Now that specialization in software engineering is important. Then we have operations. The operations team is operations engineers who have an operational background, who have then learned how to operate these frameworks, these various Sparks, Hadoops, all this stuff. But they also need to understand how your software works, the software that you've written, so that they can then support that. So there's two parts to their operational load, these frameworks as well as your own code. Now, the reason why I talked about that data, just getting that data scientist, is that's an issue. That data scientists can't do all three things. They can do the data science well, but what they are is they're consumers of data products. They are not creators of data products. And that differentiation is key, because the data scientists will consume the data products created by the data engineers. And those data engineers are able to do that because they have that software engineering background. They do have that ability to create the infrastructure, to create the data products. And then the data scientists can consume that to create these derivative data products, such as an ML model, such as an advanced analytic. But it all starts with that data engineering creating that. So then the question comes up oftentimes for management, especially, so which one's the most important? I can only hire one. Which one should I hire? And the answer is, if you're not going to do it right, maybe you don't want to do this at all, because you can see from the statistics, from my experience, your experience, hey, your odds of success on just having a data scientist do this are so low, probably not, better served not even doing it. So you do want to get all three teams together. It may not be a huge team, but you want to get all three of those people together. Otherwise, you probably won't be successful.
Hmm. If you're to pick an order of operations in terms of if they can't hire all three at once, if you were to hire one to start with, is that a viable option?
It is a viable option. And I kind of talk about this in the book. I have a chapter called basically starting a data team. And what I do is I recommend, or let me start with what often happens. What often happens is people say, I can only hire one. I'm going to hire a data scientist, or I'm going to start with a data scientist. Now, the issue there is the data scientist is that consumer. They're consuming that. So they come in on that day one and they say, okay, where is my infrastructure? Where's all my data products at? And you say, well, you were supposed to create those. And they say, me? I thought you were. So you get into this chicken and egg issue of, hey, that data scientists, they can't really do much because they don't have the data products in place. They don't have the infrastructure in place, and they're not a great one to create that. So what I recommend is if you're going to do a progression, hire your data engineer first. They will create those data products so that when you are ready to hire that data scientist, they can hit the ground running. They can actually start right then and there because the data engineer will have created those data products in preparation for that data scientist to be there. So as you're thinking about the team and you're thinking about that hiring, what you'll want to do is think about the lead times for these. So how long will it take you to hire a data scientist? How long will it take you to hire that data engineer? Now you may start, as soon as you hire that data engineer, you may start trying to hire that data scientist simply because it's going to take you 6 months, maybe longer to hire that person. But it's crucial because when a data scientist is there and they're kind of just spinning their wheels or they're the only ones there, what usually happens is you have about 6 months before they're going to quit or become just completely unproductive. So you have this person who you've hired who's expensive. They're going to spin. They're not going to be productive. And they're going to say, all right, I'm going to go start looking. And this happens consistently.
All the time. What do you? I want to get your take on this. So, why is it that there's this perception that I need to go hire a data scientist above anything else? Like that, it seems like that's automatically everybody's first hire for some reason. What's your opinion on that?
I've been giving a talk recently called Foundations of Data Teams, and in it I showed this picture, and it's a facade. It's a Hollywood facade. If you've ever seen those, when you're at a Hollywood backlot and they're filming a movie, what they have is basically the front of a building with nothing behind it. And that's called a facade. And so the building, that front of the building is held up just by some scaffolding. There's some wood just holding it up. And this is what's happened to us. We are focused on the facade. We are focused on that thing that we can see, and that thing that we can see is usually the model. Whatever that model is, whatever that analytic is, that's what we can see, and that's what we focus on. And so this also comes from the media, a lot of the positioning, where you hear about data science, you do not hear about data engineering. So that focus of, oh, if I can just get some data science going, then I'll be cool. Then I'll have that machine learning model, rather than none of these articles actually say, hey, just so you know, your data scientist won't be able to do it. You'll need this other help. So a great deal of my work, a great deal of what I've written, not just in my books, but on O'Reilly and other places, was to say, hey, look, these are two different people. We have an engineer, we have a scientist, data scientist, and the two are separate enough to where you'll need both to do this right.
Yeah, I mean, do you find that message is resonating more these days than maybe a few years ago?
It definitely is. When I was first writing, when some of the first writing I did was on O'Reilly, I wrote this post kind of. I talked about on complexity and big data. That was one of the first ones I wrote, and it was saying, hey, know that this complexity is high, and know that the majority of people can't do this. And then right after that, writing that data scientists versus data engineers, I was the lone wolf or the lone person in the woods talking about this. But now it's definitely, people are starting to hear it. I've got other people like yourself and others starting to say, hey, we actually do need data engineering too. So it's a much easier conversation. Part of it has been to put this into print. For some reason, people would believe me when I told them this. So now having it on a book is, oh, okay, well, you wrote the book on that. I guess I can believe you.
Yeah.
It is improving.
Yeah, it seems to be. I think we had pretty similar journeys in that respect, right? Where I think there was an early recognition that data science was it's pretty premature for a lot of companies. And I mean, I personally noticed a lot of data scientists starting jobs and going elsewhere, only to actually find themselves in the same situation at a different company because there was just nothing to do. And so you just kind of hop around and yeah, and I do recall actually. I'm just going to share this real quick. The article. So this is on complexity of big data. Yeah, this is I recall this one. This is one of the first articles of its kind back then. So thanks for writing this.
Oh, thank you. It was. I'd like to say it was groundbreaking for that time. It wasn't. It was starting to call out, hey,
Mm-hmm.
this isn't easy, and it wasn't well known, frankly.
Mm-mm. I think it is still unknown. I don't know about you, but I get a lot of messages about, um, you know, what is data engineering? Still, even a simple Google search doesn't seem to suffice that question. And the other ones are from data scientists looking to actually get into data engineering now, um, either because they recognize maybe that they need to sort of undo the logjam that's in front of them on their own, or maybe they just find it's a different, more interesting career field. So, um,
It
seems.
definitely is. It's happening. We're
Mm-hmm.
seeing. So one of the difficulties for data scientists is not understanding the sheer complexity of making that move to becoming a data engineer. They're thinking, in my experience, they're thinking data engineering is the memorization of API. So if I just learn a bit more programming, if I just learn this API a little bit better, that's one part of data engineering. And I tried to illustrate this in a post I recently put up on my personal site. I don't know if you saw it. It's called the technology tree, where I compared data engineering uh, to if you've ever played Civilization, you know how there's the technology tree that you couldn't start writing until you had the alphabet. And so I created this technology tree and showed here's what a data engineer has. And then that isn't the one. That's a
Or this
different
isn't
one.
it?
No,
Okay.
do it's up on my personal site. It's called uh, it should be one of the first ones up on there of the called the technology tree, or if you just do that search, Jesse Anderson
Uh,
technology tree.
yeah, it was from December 16th, right?
Yes.
Huh.
So if you look at that, what I did is I broke it down based on several different,
This one.
yes.
Okay.
So there where you have it right now, that's where this is what your data engineer needs to have. Now, this is what your lead slash senior should have. Your junior people may not have that entire tree. So this is, I broke, so yeah, scroll down there and I wanted to show, okay, sometimes people think that your DBA team, your data warehouse team is the place to home this. And what I wanted was a visual way to show, hey, not just are they missing things, they're missing some pretty substantial things. So if you bring that one up, you'll where it says DBA slash SQL focused. So it isn't just an issue of, hey, the data warehouse team doesn't know how to program, or maybe you're lucky and they know some Python. Well, guess what? They're missing a pretty substantial other, not just here, learn some syntax. It is here, learn some pretty substantial big problems of, okay, learn about architecture, learn about real-time distributed processing. That's all difficult stuff. And just on the software engineering side, it's not just, hey, learn a little bit of that syntax. It's also, okay, what about code optimization? What about multi-threading? What about distributed coordination? What about distributed systems? Difficult stuff. And as you think about that, yes, there's some SQL in there, and you can see that there on the left.
Mm-hmm.
They're able to benefit from that SQL, but if you're limited to SQL to do this, you're going to have a bad time.
Yep.
You all those things in red that you're missing. That's going to be really difficult for them to do, and it's not. Hey, it's optional. We can get by. Hey, this is actually critically should be there, has to be there. And then if you close that one, you go down to where we were talking about software engineer. That's where I think you should be starting your search for data engineers. Mm-hmm. That's a relatively common question as well. So in my opinion, you should be looking for software engineers with a passion or an interest in data. And it's because they don't have everything green, but they have some of the more difficult parts in green that then they can move on to that next thing. So if you go to the one that down below it, you'll see what started off this conversation of, is a data scientist a data engineer? What's missing? Mm-hmm. Well, you heard me talk about that, those beginner coding skills. And so you can see that they have some beginner software engineering and some beginner SQL, but that beginner SQL is nowhere near enough to be able to do this right. You're going to be missing some huge swaths. And so as I've worked with teams or worked with people data scientists who lacked the data engineers, you can see the manifestations of this. You can see this all over the place. So now coming to your original question of, let's say we were data scientists and you wanted to move over or switch careers, what should you do? Well, you're going to have to try and fill in that. And as a data scientist, know this, you should fully know this, filling in the rest of those boxes is not going to be easy. It's actually really difficult. So what you may want to do as a data scientist is know that it's going to take a long time. Maybe the grass isn't as green as you think it is. Hey, and then that book, you saw the link there, that switching careers. I have entire sections just for, if you're a data scientist, here's what you should know. If you're a DPA, if you're a software engineer. And I think it's critical because we're often told, let's say on Reddit or LinkedIn or wherever, hey, it's easy, you just do a few things. Well, it's easy if you aren't trying to get a new job. If you just want to learn this passively, hey, knock yourself out, that's pretty easy. But if you're actually going to get a new job and you are going to say, I'm going to apply to be a data engineer, know that the technical levels that you have to hit are significantly higher. What you were able to do for your coding test of, let's put you through some hello world sort of things, it's not what you're going to be doing as a data engineer. It is going to be significantly harder, and you better know that stuff, or you will not get that job. You will have wasted a lot of time and effort.
Now, on the notion of data engineering and job titles, do you see something similar happen? Because in data science, for example, I mean, it started out as maybe job titles were, maybe before 2015, it was somebody who was probably good at machine learning or something a bit more technical. And then over time, it slowly got into sort of an amorphous job title where it started to encompass a bunch of other things like analytics and BI roles and stuff. Do you see the same thing happening with data engineering titles at all and roles?
Not yet. What we saw with let me back up let me back up to what you were talking about with data scientists. Is we've seen this gradual, being a data scientist is cool. Therefore, I'm going to rename my BI team and my data analysts to be data scientists. They aren't. We just renamed them. And that didn't magically poof, with a magic wand, they're data scientists now. You've just set them up for failure, frankly. So that's one issue. I've seen that happen at a few companies. To your original question about data engineers, well, what's weird about data engineers is there's two accepted definitions. And there's data engineer who is basically a SQL focused person. So you have to make sure that management or whoever in your company understands that. Yes, when you see data engineer on their resume, you will need to look at that resume and say, is this a SQL focused person? Is this person a DBA, data warehouse? Separate from that is that software engineer that I talked about, and that's who you want for this big data side. You will need to make sure that they have that experience in software engineering. Otherwise, you don't have that data engineer. To your question specifically about am I seeing any kind of shift, anything like that? Not really. There's some weirdness out there, or some difficulty for people. Like when they see what is a data engineer at Facebook? Data engineer at Facebook means a lot of different things. In fact, when I deal with the FANG companies and I use my terms, I have to make sure I've defined them because everybody else uses different terms. And it's important. So for example, at Google, it's a software engineer that's doing this. It's not they don't call them a data engineer. So what you will want to do is to make sure, let's say you're a manager watching this, is to make sure that you do have clear delineations, clear title descriptions, not because we're trying to be gatekeepers, not because we're trying to define things and make a dictionary. It's about pay bands. If you have this wrong and you are trying to pay a data engineer, like I talk about, a SQL focused, a DBA salary, that's not going to happen. Where there's sometimes it's 60,000 US for that SQL focused data engineer. That's not going to fly with your data engineers, and you will lose out on a lot of people, and you'll constantly have to do these one-offs with HR to get that salary right, and it will be the bane of your existence.
Yeah, yeah, that doesn't sound like much fun. So
there's an entire section. Speaking of things that don't exist, that didn't exist, and so I wrote in data teams an entire section that I wanted to write this entire section for managers to be able to plop down in front of an HR person and say, here, please read this. This tells you why this is different, and so we can make this change.
that's awesome. That's really, on the topic of management too. I mean, what are your suggestions for managing a data team?
In what sense? As far as
Well, I mean,
methodologies?
Maybe best practices. I mean, because you're dealing with three different types of roles, for example, right? How do you get everyone to play nice together within the team and then within the broader organization?
So what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a symbiotic relationship. And so the symbiotic relationship should exist between the data engineers and the data scientists. You read data engineering teams. I have that in there of that high bandwidth connection that should exist between data science and data engineering. And that high bandwidth connection manifests in different ways. It can manifest if you have a poor connection between them. It could be that political issue we're talking about. There is a problem between them. So what a common problem here is data scientists view data engineers as being the sticklers, always getting in the way of their fun, and they're always trying to be so engineering and trying to design things and thinking about 10 years from now. And then on the other side, you've got the data engineers looking at these data scientists saying, man, these people are scary. They want to just run completely. They're complete cowboys. And they're doing this, they're doing that. They're not adhering to any good engineering. So you have this problem between them. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that management is handling that problem. That yes, there are times that data scientists need to run roughshod. And yes, there are times that we need to make sure we have a data engineer in the room to make sure this is engineered right. But that trade-off, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to create create value with the data at the same time as not going too far. So that's one of our best practices. It's experiential, quite frankly. Some of the other best practices that I've seen and talk about in the book is if you have the data scientists and data engineering in very different parts of the organization, that can be a whole problem unto itself, where organizationally on down, the data engineering team may have completely different priorities and therefore bonus structure, whatever, than your data scientists that are on a completely different part of the organization. And so there could be this constant triage and back and forth and trying to get, hey, the data engineers aren't doing this for us. And it can be this whole problem. And what that usually is, it's a manifestation of, hey, we have to go all the way up the org, up to some C-level person who then tells them, here, go back down. So what we may want to look at in those cases is to put them into a, excuse me, under a single C-level I talk about what maybe that C-level person, VP level person could be, but definitely, I think the best case scenario is it's a CTO or a chief analytics officer. One other big one is that some data teams think that they don't have to interface with the business. And that's another big part. There needs to be a continuing symbiotic relationship between the data teams and the business, where if the company has this culture of the tech people don't talk to the business, and in software engineering, let's say you're doing web work, you could get by with that. With data teams, you can't do that. You absolutely cannot get by with this. You absolutely have to work with the business. And this is part of that value generation that I've talked about several times. Yes, you could create the most awesome thing, the most awesome model, the most best data product possible. And if you go deliver to the business and they can't use it because you didn't do what they needed, hey, that's a big problem. You were like this when you should have been like this working with the business. Incredibly important.
And so how does a data team go about getting more political capital with the business and I suppose a broader organization?
In a word, execution. It's you can't when I mentor or work with a team that is in that sort of situation, I say you can't argue with success. And so you try to figure out some wins that you can have, some things that you can do, and then by doing that, then you will create a positive or virtuous cycle. Now, right now, if you're thinking, let's say you're working at a company and it's downtrodden and that your project's on the verge of collapse, that's a downward cycle. That's a pretty bad one. It takes quite a bit of effort to get out of that. But if you're just starting out and you're trying to turn that around, you will need to create a positive virtuous cycle. And by doing that, it's not here we just have this graph that just goes up like that. No, it's a gradual step up. And if I would encourage people to think about it that way. It's not a rocket ship going up. It's gradual improvements. And then the gradual improvement will become much bigger gradual improvements as we go along.
An interesting thing you bring up too is like organizational change and dealing with the old guard. Do you want to go into that a bit?
Sure. There's going to be some old guard who have read either cursorily or the FUD or something like that, and they say, this whole big data thing, it's a fad, it's going to go away, or we don't have big data, we don't need this, or something like that. And they're there to say no, and they're there to gatekeep. And here's the problem for, let's say you're a manager or an individual contributor on those data teams. They still have power. They have the power to say no, frankly. And that no could be, no, you're not going to get it by database, which is a pretty common one. They have the power to say no. They dig their heels in and make things take forever. So that can be a whole problem unto itself. In fact, that whole old guard is actually part of why I recommend what we talked about initially of hiring a data engineer first. It's because that data engineer is going to have to go to those people and sometimes getting their data. When we talk about silos, the silos is you're going to take this data from my cold dead hands. So it's part of them trying to, hey, pretty please with sugar on top, can I have access to your data that the data scientists may not be able to do. So we have to go through, we have to start working with that old guard. And that could manifest as that gatekeeping, as I mentioned, but it could also manifest as, hey, we have to go through and we have to deal with some of the people who are on the team that are not ready to make that jump. And that's something I talk about in a little bit in the book of, hey, part of the organizational change could actually manifest as people may need to find other homes within the organization. This means some people in the org may not be able to make this, may not want to make this journey. And it's actually critically important that you understand some people may not be able to make this. Despite their best efforts, they may not be able to make this. So you as the manager, maybe you as the VP need to understand, hey, there you may have to, as part of this big data rollout, this big data journey, there may be people that need to find homes elsewhere. There may need to be people that are uh, given more resources, given more help, given more time. There's a lot of possibilities. One thing I'd say to those people, because I've dealt with a lot of them who are part of that old guard, is, hey, there may be room for you in this. There is the need for subject matter expertise. So you heard my definition of a data engineer. Well, that definition of a data engineering team isn't primarily data engineers, but it's not wholly data engineers. And that means that there are some things that the DBAs, the data warehouse people have dealt with that the software engineers, quite frankly, may not have dealt with. So that could be some technical things, such as data lineage, or it could be things specific to the company of, I have the knowledge of how this works, and they're more of an SME on the team than they are contributing a great deal technically.
Interesting. So how does that work though if a company hires a data engineer but doesn't have the organizational will to find homes for the old guard and there's sort of a stagnation? How have you seen that situation turn out?
It turns out where there's some people that need to find homes elsewhere in other companies. So that should be known. We're seeing this already. So in the book, in that Switching Careers book, I have this entire section just dedicated to the data warehouse people and DBAs. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that DBAs and data warehouse people completely go away, but what I am saying is that those teams are reducing and they're not rehiring. So what this looks like, and this has been confirmed to me by lots of people who email me, say, hey, I was laid off and now I can't find anything. This is what's happening. So you have a 10-person, what was a 10-person, or excuse me, a 20-person, let's say, data warehouse team. By taking the abuse off that data warehouse and putting that into other technologies that can handle that, these big data technologies, Sparks, whatever, we don't need a 20-person deep team anymore that's constantly fiddling with things. We need a 10-person team. So what will often happen is there will be a reduction of force of those 10 people. And so that manifests in a few ways. One, the individuals on that team should know, hey, you may not be able to find a job, and it's going to take you a while to, if you want to become a data engineer, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of effort. My strong recommendation, start now. It's going to be know that this sort of thing is happening. Then on the company side, the HR side, they should know that as you look at, they call it workforce planning. As you do your workforce planning, you need to know that there is going to be a reduction on your data warehouse team and an increase in your data engineering team, and that you will need to hire accordingly.
And then I haven't read your Switching Careers book, but any suggestions for somebody who wants to skill up? Say you're on maybe an old data warehouse team, but you want to learn modern data engineering skills. Any suggestions on where a person should start?
I as self-serving as it sounds, I have an entire section written just for people like that, because I'm honestly worried, because I saw an issue coming where we're going to be eliminating some pretty high-paying jobs. So what we have is an issue of upward pressure. We have upward pressure from lower-paid data analysts, what somebody calls SQL developers, that sort of thing. You've got this upward pressure of now they can do more, and we don't need that. So definitely we have some issues there. What you should do is you should realize a few things. One, learning to program is not memorization of API. It is about solving problems. And That is a much more difficult proposition. Uh, Second thing is there's no cookbook. Usually with a sort of relational database, there's this cookbook of here's the execution plan. And if I twiddle the execution plan, things will change. Those execution plans don't really exist in these sorts of new big data systems. That it's much more you need to program, you need to understand how it works behind the scenes to do it the right way. So that cookbook, that cookie cutter approach does not exist yet, and probably won't exist for a while, frankly. Another thing to know is that the sheer number of technologies that you'll have to deal with will be more. It's no longer, I have spent my entire career, let's just pick on Oracle. I've spent my entire career fiddling with Oracle. It's not the way it is anymore. You're going to have to deal with the Sparks and the Hadoops and the Druids and the Pulsars and the Kafkas and the list goes on. And that list of technologies isn't us being, as engineers, just kind of going crazy. This is what we see. This is a pretty commonplace. The data doesn't live in one place. The data lives here, here, and here, and here. And they should know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. What's your take on learning cloud skills?
Learning cloud skills will be interesting. I've seen a lot of people try to push themselves as cloud architects or cloud engineers, something like that. And I I'm not sure if that actually changes the problem. So let me explain what that means. What does cloud do? Cloud solves some operational problems. Okay. You don't have to know how to spin up a Hadoop cluster by tweaking this and that config. You go to EMR, you spin up that cluster. What doesn't the cloud do? The cloud doesn't change your difficulties of architecture, and it doesn't change your programming difficulties. And so that's that realization of, hey, yeah, you as an ops person, maybe you go from DBA data warehouse into ops, and maybe your ops is focused on the cloud. That could be a way to go, and I've seen people do that. But if you are going to go that data engineer route, realize that it often doesn't make a huge difference whether you're on-prem or in the cloud from a development point of view, because you're using, let's say, Spark in the cloud and you're using Spark on-prem, and they both work the same way. There's some elasticity and dynamics there, obviously, but from a development, from an architecture point of view, it doesn't make much difference. So what people often say is, okay, cloud solves our architectural problems. Well, maybe not. This is important because just using whatever the cloud provider has may not be the right thing. Just because, let's pick on Amazon, just because Amazon has Spark doesn't mean that Spark is the right thing. Spark may actually be the worst thing that you could do, and there's some other better technology there. It's important to think through the problem and then look at the technologies, look at the use case, then look at the technologies. Don't start with the technologies and try to shoehorn them into those use cases.
On the technology end of things too, how would you suggest handling a data engineer who is really fixated on using a particular technology, like come hell or high water, like we're going to use Kafka for everything? Like,
it happens a lot, frankly, and it's this recency bias. It's a mix of recency bias and one-itis. So what I'd be looking at if I was the manager on that team, let's say I was a lead and everything was Kafka, I would make sure that that person actually understood what Kafka is and what Kafka does well. Because what they may have bought into a particular vendor's marketing message, and I could recognize that marketing message when I ask them, does Kafka do X? And their response is, oh, it does this. Hey, you just bought into a marketing message. You didn't buy into, did you look at that technically? Do you understand what that means? So there's that one part. There's that one-itis. Do they understand that, hey, Kafka is very good for this and not very good for that? Those are the questions we need to ask. Then there's also a recency bias there. What a recency bias means is, oh, I just learned Kafka. I need to put that on my resume, and therefore I'm going to shoehorn that into whatever design, no matter what, that's going to happen. So it's actually pretty important for somebody, And here's the worst one. If your lead has this recency bias or your architect has this recency bias, that's a big problem. You may be getting this architecture that is to make it so that they can get their next job rather than what's best for you. So
Yeah,
not
we
as well.
we call that a resume driven development. Um,
Resume driven development.
yeah, it's super common actually. So trying
It
to use
is.
whatever latest greatest thing because that's going to get you the job at whatever latest greatest company is using that, right? So it's it's hard to quash this though, right? Because especially when when you point out when made the lead his or herself is pushing uh, you know one-itis or recency bias. It's kind of like it's a tough one, and then management's none the wiser because there's like, well, we're relying on you to make the architectural decisions for this. So
One of the things I have in the book that I don't think anybody has ever talked about is what should a architect look like on a data engineering team. So I have a
that's a good
pretty
question.
sizable section in that chapter, and there's one manifestation that I didn't talk about, and that's architecture by white paper. I just read a vendor's clouds white paper, and boom, that's everything we ever need. And we're just going to copy and paste that. So copy, paste, and now we have this recommended vendor architecture that more than likely does not do what we want it to do. And so you have this whole issue of the person who created that architecture didn't understand the trade-offs, and so they went to the vendor white paper. Oh, there it is. Yank that, and now we're good to go. And no, we're not good to go. We're actually going to paint ourselves into lots of problems. So let's say you're a manager watching this and you're thinking, oh, God, is that going to happen? Well, could happen. What my company's often brought in to do is to be that second opinion, that second pair of eyes. Not vendor beholden, not there to sell you Kafka, not there to sell you Spark, to do what's best for you. So I'll do that, and I'll often find, hey, you're actually using this wrong. You don't understand this right. You didn't really think through the use case here. But really what I want you to know is if you're, let's say you're a management level, maybe you're CXO watching this thinking, okay, what does this look like? This looks like sometimes a year or more of if you've done this wrong, you can lose a year. Not just a year of development, but a year to go back and redo it right. And that can be incredibly, incredibly painful.
I mean, you point out an interesting architectural discussion that I hear quite often. Um, Netflix is doing it this way, so we should do it this way. Or Google's doing it, using technology X, therefore we have to use technology X in much the same way. Do you come across that thought process at all?
I do. In fact, I have a post that I've been wanting to write about that. So here's the thing with that. Uh, there's parts to those decisions that they may not say in that blog post, or their blog post is there to save face for their next job, frankly. I've seen that with some of the posts where, oh God, you made some terrible decisions and you really just completely abused and misused that technology, but you need to get that next job in Silicon Valley or wherever. So here's how I'm going to spin that. So yes, just because technology company X does it this way or that way, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same way. Here, I'll share this with you. Since I've consulted so much throughout the world, I know what technology stack at this company and this company are, and they're in the same industry. In fact, direct competitors. Their technology stacks are different, and they're different because they have different use cases that they're trying to accomplish. It is not that they're both in whatever industry they're in. It's that, okay, we are trying to do this in this company, we're trying to do this other thing in this company. And so in a very similar way, if you just look at it and you say, Apple's doing it this way, well, Apple's trying to do this, this, and this. And they have an army of people to support it. And they have an army of people who are writing it, so in some cases contributing to it. So make sure that when you make those decisions, that you are looking at the use case first, not the technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you said. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of like cargo cult data science, data engineering, and so forth, right? So, um, yeah, thanks for. It personally irks me too because I think I hear this quite often too, where it's it's more kind of why you'd hire McKinsey, right? So basically, you get the stamp of approval that this is signed off on by a leading expert. Therefore, I should go ahead and do this. I think a lot of architectural decisions are similar-ish, where it's, as you point out, there's use case and there's technologies, and sometimes those are backwards. Sometimes the decision's made because if it's good enough for company X, it's good enough for us, even though we're only 3 people and just getting started. So it's an interesting
Yeah,
one.
yeah, you definitely want to think about where you are in that journey,
Uh-huh.
what resources you have in that journey. The resources. I know a lot of people that work at Fang, and their skills are a different level than what you'll find at other companies, and you should take that into consideration. Another thing I'd point out there is the Fangs also have the resources to spin up a project if it doesn't exist. And whereas, um, don't do this. Don't write your own distributed system. Just please don't. It's not as easy as you think. I don't care if they did their PhD in this. I don't care if they have their master's in this. It is not what you want to be doing. And yeah, please just don't do this. I've seen people do this with their own Kubernetes, trying to use Kubernetes to create their own distributed system. It's just not that easy. You you have an 80%. In fact, I in the book in Data Teams, I talk about this with Dmitry Ryboy from Twitter, where yeah, Twitter had the resources to create some of these early things that didn't exist. And if you're a 3-person company, if you're a 10-person, if you're a 100-person, your core competency does not exist in distributed systems creation. You are a user of distributed systems. You'll be so much better off. Please don't do that.
Kind of wrapping up, is there anything that you've learned since data teams went to publication that you wish you would have written about in data teams?
There is one part that I guess for a second edition, I would talk about product management,
Hmm.
product managers. What do those look like, and what should that be? Because that was something I left off. I didn't have the data, but we are seeing the importance of it coming out. Where there, who is responsible for pushing that product over the finish line, and what level of skill do they need, and what should that look like? So what I generally say is, hey, if this is a pretty technically difficult, not just data science wise, data engineering wise, you'll probably have to get somebody who actually held the title of data engineer or data science to run that right. Now, that contrasts with, let's say, we're doing something less technical, less easier, more straightforward. You may be able to use one of your existing product managers. They'll need to bone up on all this. They'll need to learn about models, that sort of thing, to understand it. But that may not be they may not have to be completely retrained, completely rehired. But you will want to look at that. You will want to see who is doing that. One of the issues I have seen is uh, the data teams and data scientists wanting to say, I don't want to interact with those business people. Can't the product manager do it? And so it's this kind of shift off that we had with software engineering. And hey, that isn't the right way to do this either. The product manager may be great at, running those Gantt charts, making sure that we actually hitting what the business wants. But at some point, you, data scientist, data engineer, need to be touching that business person, not in a bad way, not in HR going to get in trouble with HR, but you should be interfacing with that person. And that's where you're going to find that highest amount of value. But there does need to be some level of product ownership, product management, and it changes in there. Perhaps one other thing that I talk about operations, but I didn't go deeply into the ML ops. ML ops is going to to be is becoming more and more important, where we talk about the operations. I talk about the operations. There's the operations of those frameworks and of your code, but then there's this whole other issue of how do you do operations for models and who's responsible for that. So I would talk about that in the book as well.
Yeah, I totally agree on ML ops. It seems like, I mean, if you'd been paying attention, I mean, it's been around for, I think, in some iteration for a long time, but it seems like just only recently has been hitting mainstream. Um, and yeah, I totally agree. I think the next year or two, it's ML engineer. That's going to be, it'll be interesting to see what happens with that title too. I'm curious to see personally how many data engineers end up becoming ML engineers and how many data scientists end up trying to go into that direction too. But I think from the reasons you pointed out though with the data scientists, that transition might be more challenging. So we'll see.
It definitely will be. I tell people who aren't versed in this, I say the ML engineer is who you originally thought you were hiring when you hired that data scientist.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Well, cool. If people want to find out more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You've got the website for the book. That's datateams.io. It direct links there to Amazon and to buy it on Apress. You can get some more sample chapters, table of contents. I did some videos on there talking about a few subjects that I didn't talk about in the book. I guess to your previous question, how do you interview, that sort of thing? How do you set goals? It's all really important there. Yeah, you're there on the site. So you've got the videos. There's an extra case study on there. I'm really proud of those case studies. Those case studies did not exist before that. Nobody had really talked about 10 years on, or over the course of 10 years, what does a data team look like? What are those sorts of step functions and problems you have? Nobody talked about that there in the book.
Yeah, I thought that was a really cool addition, the case studies part, right? Yeah, I hadn't seen that either. So.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so that next one that I did another one for Criteo so that people could, you've got your European bent on that. I also added some stuff about COVID where we talked about COVID in there. So definitely check that out. Other place to find me is at my personal site, jesse-anderson.com. There, years and years of blogs about data engineering. You brought a few up. The technology tree, that's where you can download a lot of the free books that I've written. So yep, there we are. You have a lot of blogs. So there one is about I think it's time we change how we manage those teams. That's a post I wrote where what we're hitting now with some of more of the advanced teams is we're not hitting an issue of we're just learning, we're trying to do this or that. Mm-hmm. It's actually an issue of, hey, we are bottlenecking our people. And that's kind of what I talk about in there is how do we get this emergence from our people rather than everything else. If you go down back down again.
Sure, real quick. That's right.
There's this book that I read. See, it says "Turn the Ship Around: A True Story of Turning Followers into Leaders." It's a super interesting book. Not found. Oh. All right. Well, it's if you do an Amazon search, I'll have to fix that link. But it's super interesting because it's by this guy who is a Navy submarine captain, and he started to see this issue of people not being feeling like they could take charge or be a leader. And in some ways, that's what's happening with our data teams, that we've stymied our people. We've hired these high-end people, these smart people, and then we go around and we bottleneck them and say, you can't make a decision. You're going to have to put it through the committee. So those of you who are listening to this, I would love to work with somebody who's wanting to do this, because I think it would be interesting to try some of what he talks about in there with a data team, because if you think about what he did, if you read the book, he actually did that with a nuclear reactor. If you think that there's a problem with safety, or hey, there's a problem with doing this if we give too much people too much leeway. Well, guess what? That sub would have blown up if this was a problem. So here we are with our data teams. It's not going to blow up your company, and I'd really like to see this in action, where I think we could fundamentally change how we work as data teams, how we empower our people. Lots of companies talk about empowerment, and it's just a word. Let's see how we really do this. Let's see how we really empower people.
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting balance between accountability and responsibility, right? So it seems like a lot of people in data teams have a lot of um, accountability, some responsibility. So yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I'll second that. If anyone wants to try this out, get a hold of Jesse. So, are you on social media at all? If you are, any places there you want to shout out?
Yeah, Twitter, I'm at Jesse T. Anderson. On LinkedIn, I believe it's Jesse T. Anderson there too.
Okay.
Uh, you can just you can search. It's as well as it's on my personal site.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Jesse, this has been a great talk. So, yeah, thanks for everything you've done. Like I said, I've been a big fan of your writings for a while, so it's good to finally chat, and I hope to do it again someday. And whenever you have a new article or a new book or whatever, I'm happy to talk about that too. So, all
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Joe. I really appreciate it.
right, cool. All right, take care.
Bye.
All right, see ya.